Hello and welcome to your October 20th, 2023. Mine just are always on. Edition of your Cincinnati, they are, Cincinnati Board of Education Policy and Equity Committee meeting. As is customary, we will begin with a round of introductions, starting with the man behind the curtain. Rob Tech. Next, Phyllis.
Jen Wagner, Treasurer.
Erin Impus, CFP Field Representative.
Mike Morosky, Board Member.
Eve Bolton, Board Member.
Hi, Derek Little, Chief of Staff.
Ian Hoying, General Counsel.
Stephanie Scott, Assistant General Counsel.
Emily Bell, Ashley, Local 232.
Thank you all so much for being here. And as always, thanks to all the staff, administration, counsel's office, and others who put together all of the documents for today. We are going to begin with a continued discussion, policy 5330, which is the use of medications. If you tuned in last time or watched the minutes or read the minutes, you'll note that this had come up a few times from Cincinnati Federation of Teachers, and we had a great discussion about use of medications and who can administer medications and what sort of trainings they may or may not have to go through to do that, because some staff members weren't comfortable doing so. And so we're going to continue that discussion today. And as we usually do, I will kick it over to General Counsel's office to see if there is anything to update us on.
I will be handling this policy. I think at the last meeting we pretty much confirmed that the policies was still in line with statutory law, and then at the suggestion of board members last time we added the explicit liability language that was in the statute, and so you'll find that at the end of the policy. Under section H, and then, I'm sorry, under section, the liability language is under B3, and then additionally, we added special provisions, a carve out for field trips and extracurriculars, which you'll find at the end in section H. And then also, as we, again, we're just trying to ensure that this policy kind of address some of the recent concerns and things like that have been raised. Just this week, we had an issue that came up with field trips as it related to, I think it was an all third grade field trip for the district or something, but it was about the medications that needed to go on the field trip with the students. And so reasonably in the past, our practice has been that, of course, if children need their meds as far as, inhalers and certain medications, that those would go on the field trips, and the staff that was going on those field trips would be responsible and kind of check in with the nurse to make sure that they knew all the things that needed to be done. But there was some kind of confusion now, I think it's because of just a recent conversation around this policy that some staff were concerned that they could no longer do that. And so we emphasized that under section C4, that as long as there was parental consent, that could happen, but we did notice that maybe the language needed to be cleaned up a little bit better. So we're also suggesting an additional red line under C4, where it currently reads, students may self-administer prescribed medication by injection or by inhaler with the signed consent from parent. We're going to add the word including. So it would now read, students may self-administer prescribed medication, including by injection and by inhaler with signed consent from a parent or guardian, because we believe the intent is for, again, we don't want students being prohibited or not being able to go on field trips just because they need medications while they're with us during school hours. So I'll take any questions as it relates to the policy.
Thank you, Ms. Scott. Well, today is easy. I don't need to choose some. Go ahead, Ms. Bolton.
You do that normally.
I tend to lean to the, I've been accused of worse.
Yeah. And then,
Yeah.
okay. A couple questions.
Yes.
First of all, you mentioned that last part of that in reference to field trips.
Yes.
Is that connected with field trips, or is that a more general rule regarding
I think it's a more general rule about being able to self-administer, but it kind of directly relates to field trips, because that would probably be the primary reason in which a student would need to do that. But it could be in reference to other situations as well. But you need parental consent. So it would be something that the parent would already consented to in advance, or if they hadn't yet, that it's something the teacher or the chaperones could do in advance of the field trip to make sure we have that.
And of course, 1,000 years ago when I taught, that would, and I imagine this is true, that's that medical release form that's probably kept at the home site regarding this each school. But when it was field trip, my recollection, this was always an issue. When we take a field trip, especially if it's overnight or whatever, like Washington, D.C. or what have you, Wyoming City Schools would make sure there was somebody that was qualified that would be able to administer the medicine, so they would have to be part of that trip rather than necessarily the chaperone might be the holder of the medication, and that was whoever was in charge of the trip, but that person wasn't necessarily the person that would administer. So sometimes you would work it out that you build into the cost of doing it a staff person, or that staff person maybe would be specifically trained prior. Is that just a Cadillac version, or?
Well, I mean, I think again, and me and Dan were discussing this yesterday when this issue came up. I think some of the decisions and practices that we have in place all are kind of built around common sense. And so, like you said, I think some of those things have been in practice because it makes sense to plan. If you know a child is going on a field trip and there's special things that need to take place, that the school would take those type of precautions. But I think in reviewing this, that's what we're trying to do, is kind of bolster the language. So we still expect the school, and when it's possible, to have that trained designee and so on and so forth. But when it comes to like a daily field trip, I think there was some misunderstanding that there had to be, again, for just a heightened kind of special person to be able to go on a field trip to the zoo or something, when it was just really just a matter of the nurse sharing with those who are going on the field trip, such and such needs their inhaler, so this is the time that so-and-so needs their certain medication that they would normally take throughout the school day.
So they would actually, whoever would be the employee or whomever was doing that, obviously it would have to be an employee. It couldn't be like a parent volunteer or anything.
Exactly.
So they would have some sort of orders, so to speak,
Right.
about the med. So
Yes.
I think we need to, I know that's a lot of procedure, and I know we don't want to do a lot of procedure in the policy, but since there's a lack of clarity and a big worry about stuff, so that's how you would handle that somebody would be briefed, but not necessarily, but other teachers, other staff members can access the meds under those circumstances.
Well, because currently in our policy, again, it talks about a training program, which I think, again, there's kind of a
Unclear.
right. It's kind of, I mean, we do have a specific training program, but in this specific case, as long as the designees, but usually it's the nurse, kind of shares those orders with whoever's in charge or on staff going on that field trip, that would be sufficient. That would be the training necessary for just a one-off field trip that day. And I would assume, again, just like the policy says, if there's a staff person that's going that's not comfortable doing that, they would need to raise that before the field trip, so that way we could, make provisions to ensure that, again, we weren't prohibiting a student being able to participate in the field trip for that reason, that we can make the proper arrangement. Is there anything else that Dan you want to add?
No, that's it. The way you described that is exactly how we handled the situation yesterday too, which was it was a day field trip. It wasn't a trip to DC. And instead of telling 3 kids they couldn't go on the field trip, which wasn't unacceptable, what we had the teacher in charge connect with the nurse and say, these are the 3 kids that needs meds. This is when they need them. Essentially be trained on those 3 kids. If you were planning a larger trip to DC International, I think it's a different situation where you would want somebody that is trained, has gone through the online portal, for example, etc.
Procedurally, are those written orders, or is it just handed rather casually?
For the doctor?
No, I'm talking the medical
The
person.
school has written orders.
Okay,
That's right. And
but then
those
those would be
shared with-
transferred.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
The only other thing I was going to add that we did add to the policy as well, in addition to putting you put the liability that employees aren't liable for this. We also said, however, the district will use good faith efforts to select employees that volunteer and who are comfortable with this designation.
Yes.
So we're not, that's been a discussion, I think, with the unions that this is not going to be somebody who is doing this against their will.
do employees have the right of refusal?
Yes.
They do expressly under the diabetes policy as well.
And there was some sort of public comment the other day about diabetic service and stuff. We do provide diabetic
course.
services. Okay,
Yes.
because somehow it went out into the public. I heard it twice last night. You all don't do diabetic service. Yes, we do.
We're required to.
Yeah. So I don't know what was said, but that's confusing. I'm good.
You good? Thank you, Ms.
I
Bolton.
think so.
I'm gonna, Ms. Amos, would you like?
I have a couple,
Good.
questions. IDs here. Okay, I have a question specifically about the diabetes care. And Dan, I think you just mentioned that teachers expressly have a right
They do.
to,
That's right.
all employees do. Is that in the, I'm sorry, I'm not as familiar with this as I should be, but can you show me where that is in the policy?
So it's in the statute.
Okay.
So Ohio Revised Code,
3317.
yeah, 3313.7112.
Could we incorporate that in the policy? Because there has been, I know, a lot of confusion around this. Teachers have been told
Yes.
they are responsible for the diabetes care for a student on a field trip, that they must do it, and they don't feel comfortable doing it. They're not the person who's normally responsible for the student, and they said, quick and dirty kind of training on how to do this is not, I feel very uncomfortable. It's a lot of, it can have serious consequences if you do it improperly. They don't know how to calculate carbs, etc. So I just want to be really clear that that the statute is incorporated and that teachers are not required to do that at any point, and including in a field trip.
I don't want to interrupt, but I can read the sentence from the statute. Policy, which says, no employee of a board of education or government shall be subject to a penalty or disciplinary action under their district policies for refusing to volunteer to be trained in diabetes care. Which that is this language. I have no problem including it. I will point out the challenge that this presents to, because the statute literally says schools must provide this care to students and may not require employees to do it, which is just, it's like a complete, we rely on, and we have discussions with, we rely on employees many times to do this. And so, yes, we don't want people doing it that are not comfortable or not trained, but we also don't want the unions discouraging people from becoming trained and who are comfortable with it. That makes sense, because it is an impossible job otherwise.
That completely makes sense, but I think you put your finger on it. Teachers do feel very pressed to do it. They are told to do it. They're not, and they don't feel comfortable, and they ask us a lot, do I have to do this?
Yeah.
So I think that would be very helpful to have that incorporated in the policy, so it's there for everybody to see.
I don't have any issue with that. Do you either?
No, two different appearances last night, and this topic came up, and we're not teachers. One was a para in our district who felt compelled and less able to say no, and another person was a parent. The kid was maybe, felt awkward not being able to go on a field trip or something. So we have major internal communication problems in the district, and we have to work through those. But yeah.
Well, and we can all, we
You
can
know,
lean
there's
on
much.
clear policy to communicate better. So I think that's what, we can do with this one, and like a lot of the ones we've done this past year, past few years. So I only have one comment. Are you good, Ms. Imbis? You
And
good?
thank you.
Great, no problem. Thank you. And Ms. Bolton, you're good? So my only comment, and this has nothing to do necessarily with the policy, but what happens because of the policy, and probably just a comment and not a question. If there is a response to it from the smart people in the room over here, I'm looking at two of them, Ms. Scott and Mr. Hoying, feel free to respond. But, the issue I have is we don't have a nurse in every building, and, we need help to have a nurse in every building. And so when we talk about, we used to have a nurse in every building, and maybe the city could help us find that this next budget cycle. I think it's unlikely because they have their own issues, but they do have some carryover money that, who knows, maybe that could be used to help with nurses. I guess It sounds like if a building needs a nurse to tell teachers or the person who has volunteered to administer the medication on a field trip, for example, because that's the example we were talking about with the nurse would give the instruction, we would find a nurse for that purpose, obviously, if they're that, right?
Yeah, it's tricky though, because field trips, it's easier in the school building because you have a nurse on site.
Correct.
Generally, but a field trip, you can't take the nurse out of the building.
Yeah.
I mean, we have at times for especially for complicated care, for we have kids on tube feeds and all kinds of things. We'll send an LPN. We'll contract to get an LPN, but this is a real challenge for the district right now. There's no other way to say it.
And that's really, I guess, just wanted that to be noted and for folks to know, and the one person watching, and hopefully more people that will watch when we present the minutes, that it is a challenge and we need help.
How do we work out all this intercession stuff that our Montessori's and other schools have? Because the children aren't necessarily, and the teens aren't necessarily in the building, and they're out and about. How are we providing the coverage that we're supposed to be providing on intercession days?
Exactly the same issue. I mean, there you have maybe 20 field trips going on
Every
one
bit of
day.
it.
And so we can't tell kids they can't participate in this, or and so school staffs, the best they can, they often do rely on teachers and other, who are willing to, and parents who are willing to be trained to enable kids to go on those experiences.
Seems like we almost need a part-time or full-time, temporary, whatever you call it, not response team, but a platoon team or whatever that covers from multiple. I mean, district-wide would be, I mean, maybe they do something else in the district, but this is a bigger and bigger problem because there are more and more children that are having these issues, and the greater and greater demand that they be fully participatory.
Yep.
So I'm writing down more things that we want to spend money on, Jen. I'll share
that'll
that
be-
next
that'll-
hour.
That'll be, you
Okay,
guys have,
more nursing
have
and
fun
medical services.
and the medical platoon, that we can assign to Mary's.
I just wrote it down. That's what we're going to
All
call
right.
them too.
We're gonna move right on to continue
Mike, I just wanted to bring one more thing. I'm sorry. And we also, the recommendation was for us to change the title so that it'd be more applicable. So we did that too. So I just wanted to make sure you all noticed that.
Oh, yeah.
The next time you see it, the
Yeah.
title will be different.
It is a much better title.
Yes,
And I realize
please.
this hasn't been affected in 12 years,
No,
so
it's been a
these
long
changes
time.
are very good. Thank you, Ms. Scott, for updating this for us. I think it is more clear. And
So we'll
thanks,
move
Ms.
forward.
Imbis, for help.
So we're moving forward with
Yeah.
this, with the changes, okay?
Yeah, we can move forward with it and recommend it for approval. It doesn't need to be Monday, I don't think, but yeah, and including the ORC language inclusion. If we can do it Monday, great, because it's really important, but
It's hot, so
Yeah.
that's good.
great. Policy 6152. We've been talking about this a couple meetings. This is a really important one, as well as is everything we discussed in here. And this one regards student fees, fines, and charges. And then related to it, item number 3 on the agenda, penalties regarding student fees. There has been conversation in this committee about waiving all student fees. And thankfully, we have the treasurer here who helped put some of that into context for us the last time, and I'm sure we'll have more discussion about that today. So again, this is policy 6152, and I'll see if Ms. Scott or Mr. Hoying have anything to add from last time before we get started, or Ms. Wagner?
So as promised, we've done some analysis and met with a few principals, like 5 or 6 principals, to get feedback on their concerns. The biggest concern from the schools was not to eliminate all fees, particularly around like the AP exam test is an add-on fee. So the fees that we were talking about were just the district supply fee. But schools have the ability to add on different fees for different things. So SCPA, Clark does the intercession. Those are more student activity stuff. So I assured them that we're not talking about eliminating student activity fees for field trips or stuff like that. We were just talking about, at least my understanding, was the district base fee. the data doesn't always tell us which fee they're collecting, whether it's a district base or a student activity, or not a student activity, a fine, or whether it's like an add-on for them. So last year we charged $713,000 in student fees. We collected $413,000. So the other concern for the principals is that whatever decision is made, it is that it's very clear communication, because there'll be a lot of confusion. They have, like, Walnut Hills has their foundation that helps make up the difference on the AP exams, because their kids take a lot of them and they can be quite costly. And so I try to come up with some scenarios where if we waive these fees, how would it impact the budget without harming schools? So I did a couple different options, and I put this in the finance committee because I thought it's on both agendas. So I don't have handouts here, but I can certainly provide them. So if we went with all students being charged at the district full fee rate, non-discounted, we would need $1 million on the budget.
I just wrote that down on my more money,
More money.
all the fees.
If we, not every child gets the full fee in reality because it's based on income. If we went to all students using the discounted rates, so I'm sorry, let me back up a second. So you need $1 million in the budget, and then one school would be harmed, but I think what's in there is their own fees on top of it. So it's like it was Clark. So let me just use the math as an example. So for Clark Montessori, they collected $41,000 in fees last year, but if I charge every student at Clark the full rate, it would only be $24,000. So I think the $41,000 in collection is above and beyond what we're talking about. So it looks like they'd get harmed, but I don't think so. But because they're not coding the receipts the way we charge it, it's hard to tell. But if I go to all students being charged the discounted rate, it would be a $656,000 add to the budget, and it looks like 5 schools would lose money in the deal, Clark still being that one that I think is an anomaly. And then I started playing around with the average collection rate at $500,000, and 13 schools might lose money in the deal. And then I tried to play with it to see if I can minimize the number of schools that lost money. Settled at a 17 per student flat rate, and that would add $500,000 to the budget. So we didn't really get a chance to talk at the leadership team about it. I think we ran out of time, and we decided we wanted to go to the board, just try and get some feedback on is this something that we want to add to the budget and waive the district-based fees?
I really appreciate you doing all this homework for us. It makes a lot of sense to me.
I'm sorry I don't have it on a screen to show you
You're
all the
fine.
math. Okay.
No, those are simple enough numbers. I got it in my brain. Also, it sounds like it was a worthwhile exercise because it showed maybe some anomalies that may exist, which is good too.
Good.
So I always try to go last, but this is great. And I think, yeah, the board needs to talk about it. We don't really need to talk about the policy today because unless we decide on something, which we're not going to. But I want to see if Ms. Bolton has any comments.
Well, from a finance perspective, I've talked to the treasurer about some of this too, and I think that we did leave it at policy, just the district fees and fines. I don't know that the board is concentrating only on the district fees. I honestly think the board is thinking in terms of school fees as well. And I know that those of us that have been around a long time are sure that a decade or so ago, we've somehow eliminated the pay to play, but obviously we didn't. And I do think there are these differences among our schools. And this has, and it's some of our schools have those foundations. And it's not always the ones you know that you think it is. We have a number of our schools that have foundations that you wouldn't necessarily know that they would have foundations. And I'm really proud of that. But I honestly think the board is talking about all fees.
Even the fines?
No, fees.
Fees.
fees, something that allows you to play, or something that you have to pay in order to participate.
Got it.
I think there is now I'm only speaking for myself about fines. I think fines are very reasonable. The fact that we don't communicate it very well, or we don't keep track of it, or it's the last minute and you don't get to walk, which of course they do get to walk, but they don't get the sheepskin or whatever. That's an issue.
That was old school.
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
That's right. That's what it is, baby. It's the sheepskin.
love it.
That's what it is.
So can I ask a clarifying question?
Yeah.
When you say all fee, you said no money to participate. Are you talking about field trips too? Really?
Think about that.
Intercessions?
Think about that.
Oh, you're talking
Millions.
millions of
But that's
dollars.
what we said when we talked. I think the board's talking about wanting to see all of that.
Oh, I completely
I know,
misunderstood.
but no, leaving where you were right out of policy. You were
Okay.
right out of policy.
This is
It
her
was
fault, not
district.
me.
This is, am I
You're right.
wrong?
No,
This
you're
is
not wrong.
where the board, I think, is. We know we can't possibly afford all of this, but if you really want to talk about equity, there's equity in the fact that the kids that can afford it get to do it. The kids that can't afford it don't get to do it. That's equity. But the reality is, if there's some kids that can't afford it, or if we are spending $1 billion and still charging families for the bus ride to the zoo, that's not a good PR experience either. So I just think that more research it'd be interesting. Because schools will fight that like heck,
I
making fun of me, but the sheepskin, baby.
I would
Dan's
find
bad.
it.
Dan is a bad.
Dan
He
is
is
a
a
bad
bad
influence on me.
influence.
He's a bad influence on me.
I know he is, and think about what that means.
I wasn't like this before I got here.
Not at all.
So I'm running a report. I should be able to tell you how much we collected in student activity funds
Oh, yeah.
last year. That doesn't mean it's all inclusive though. I have to think through that a little bit more, and so I'll do some more research. But I completely
Millions.
missed that one. So
You did
All
not miss
fees.
it, Jen. You
Okay.
did not miss it. If out of policy, it was only about district fees. But I'm just saying, I believe the board is talking about everything.
okay, got it.
And that discussion, we'll have that in
That's
a
huge.
board matters discussion, probably not Monday, but I'll present this when I present the minutes, whether it's Monday or a future one. And again, that's not any pressure on you, Phyllis. It's not, we don't need to have these on Monday, but
Mm-mm.
I'll bring it up either way during announcements. Because I do think Eva's right. I do think that's where the discussion is. And Eve's also right that out of this committee, Jen, that's all we were talking about.
Okay.
So, I think there's probably a good middle ground somewhere. If nothing else, we do have to have the discussion because, just, for example, I'm like this proudest. I'm so excited. My kid's on his first field trip today ever in his whole life, and so I'm like a nut about it. I'm really excited.
You're not on it?
But he's
because
going. I
you're
know
here.
because I'm here, and I want and I also don't want to. I don't. I'm trying to like not be like that
You're gonna be a
guy.
mess.
Trying,
You're gonna be a mess.
but he needed $5 to buy a pumpkin. Because they're going to the pumpkin patch, and every kid needed $5, and I'm confident. In fact, I know that the good folks at Hayes Porter are going to make sure that every kid can get their pumpkin. Not every single kid in James's class can bring $5
That's
to
right.
school. So anyway, but that's just sorry when you were talking, it was just relevant in my mind. But anyhow,
It also impacts, and of course, it impacts the planning of field trips. We don't do enough field trips, and part of it was transportation, part of it's the cost, part of it's all this stuff. So it also is impacting the general instructional opportunities or enhancement that our kids need. Our kids need more enhancement of activities, and we're trying to figure out ways to do that, but it's
So
on the list.
So 2 years ago, I think it was, I was approached by a grandparent who was questioning, well, some schools had more field trips than other schools, and he was asking me in relation to the equity policy.
Sure.
And, I tried to explain to him that the schools make those plans in their budgets, so it's not a district requirement or a minimum. And it's a lot of times it's programmatic, but it's something so interesting to consider.
Yeah, the other thing I was glad to sit in on that conversation. It was a fun conversation with the principals, the high school and elementary principals about the fee. But the one thing I didn't expect or learned from that conversation was the sort of dissension it created a little bit between the elementary and the high school principals, because what will happen is that fee will rack up year after year for the elementary schools and not get paid. And then when they go to high school and now need a transcript or need graduation, it gets paid. And the high school gets, like, I'm pretty sure, right, Jen? The high school was depositing, it's not like there's a split that goes back to the years that they were at the elementary school. That was kind of an interesting revelation.
And that's the accountability piece too.
And that's
it rolls on rolls and rolls and rolls on. No, every year people need to be aware, or even people need to be informed that this is happening. But again, if we're not charging for some of this stuff.
This has been a good exercise, I think, for a whole lot of reasons, it sounds like. And even for the buildings too, like to learn these things. All right, so we will discuss with the full board, and then I know Jen's going to be presenting this again, some version of this at Finance next. So we'll keep it on everyone's mind, and more board members will get to hear this at the next meeting. So on the agenda next, and then on other business, our other business is going to be regarding drills, safety drills, and that's why we have Dr. Little here, I believe, which is good. But it's not on the agenda, but it's under other business. We also have a few other things, it looks like, Mr. Hoying, under other business, proposed new things. But before then, I believe it was Ms. Weinberg that brought up the last meeting, safety of students attending after-school activities. Is that right?
I think it was related to specifically games and whether the safety, I think her question was whether the safety precautions that are taken at, let's say, Starkville Stadium are the same safety precautions for spectators and fans coming into Walnut Hills or Withrow, or are they common safety precautions? Yeah. And I have confirmation. I talked to Josh Harden. Josh said actually that was a big point of emphasis for Laura Mitchell. They weren't always, we used to have kind of scattered procedures for how we were handling games. And under Laura, she was adamant that each site use the same precautions. We use, for outside games, we use the handheld wands, metal detection wands for every site, for every stadium and event. And the other safety precaution Ms. Weinberg asked about is to confirm that we have a once in, once out policy. So once you come into the stadium, if you leave, you can't leave at halftime, go to your car and come back in. It is a once in, once out. And that's true at all the sites as well. So Josh confirmed that. I talked to Strader, Robert Strader, who organizes the security for games. He comes under your purview. He confirmed that's the same process that we use at every school. I didn't know if you had anything
two quick things to add to that. In advance of the school year, the athletics team, the security team, and CPD also sit down and look at the entire schedule to confirm assignments and coverage for each event and competition. And then at the start of each season, so fall, winter, and spring seasons, that happens at a school level as well. So the athletic director pulls together the coaches and the campus security team to review what's coming up for that season as well. So there's preparation in advance of each cycle of events.
Great. Thanks, Joe. We will pass that on to Ms. Weinberg. Good, Ms. Bolton? Mm-hmm. So we have a couple proposed new policies. Let's do that, and then we can turn it over to Dr. Little, if that's all right. We have a proposed new policy, 7. I'll just turn it over to y'all to introduce. We have 3 things here. Is that right?
Yeah. These are, sorry. So 2 that are really for your notification and 1 that we're prepared to move forward. So in general, our practice has been for financial policies. They've sort of been worked up by the finance committee and then passed on to us. So 2 policies that I think are on the agenda to discuss today with the finance committee, 2 new policies are a gifts policy, gifts, grants, and bequests. This is a policy that's pretty common for school districts. Actually, this one is pulled very close to Columbus City Schools. It gives direction to the district as to how to handle gifts, grants, and bequests. What needs to be recognized by the board and what can be accepted. So that's the gifts, grants, and bequests. Looking forward to hearing what the Finance Committee has to say about that. And then second is a policy that is really long overdue, again, a new policy relating to crowdsourcing. This is something the Ohio Auditor has recommended that school districts have a policy for some time, I think back to like 2018. This incorporates some of the recommendations from the auditor, looks at what other school districts have done. And this relates to sites like GoFundMe. I think there's classroom-specific sites, teacher-specific sites that are being used for crowdsourcing. And so this talks about how we would do that. So those are two policies that would be discussed by Finance today. And then lastly is a policy that, as I understand, Finance has already discussed and moved on to us, which is this 6233, amenities for participants at meetings and other occasions. And really the only thing added there, Jen, I think, is the sentence to say all purchases must be necessary, reasonable, and adhere to the allowable expense guideline. And then there's a separate procedure that I think the Treasurer's Office.
Right. So it took us a while to develop that allowable uses by fund because every grant has different rules. So we published that last year, but we wanted to add this language to the policy so that when people violate it, we have some teeth, behind it. And then, so we review the allowable uses. I think it was in Finance last month.
2 months ago, whatever.
Whichever. But so that's all we're doing is saying we didn't want to put the allowable uses in this because they change when different grants come. So we just want to make sure, and we'll publish them every year, and review them with the schools every year. But we want to make sure that we strengthen this policy a little bit.
I appreciate that. I also appreciate the wording of when somebody violates. Because it's going to happen. No, I mean, that's why we have these
We're
policies.
human.
Look,
We all make mistakes.
hey, look,
Right.
I'm with you. I'm squarely with you. No, I think these look great. And do we need to pass forward the new one then?
Yeah.
We need to pass it forward for approval from the full board. I think we're good,
Just
right?
6233. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
All
we'll
right.
move that one
Great.
forward.
Yeah. The other two we're going to talk about at Finance Committee
Great.
in more detail.
This is awfully convenient to have the finance chair on this committee, and we can just kind
I
of
think we ought to keep it that
rock
way.
through these, right? Yeah, no,
In
it's good.
January.
Love
I
it.
like these committees.
I do too.
So I have an update on the student activities.
Oh,
Here we go. Fasten your seatbelt.
So the Funds 200 are student managed activities. So like the senior class club and, those kinds of things. They collected $215,000 last year. The district managed student activities was 2.4 million. And then just to remind you that the supply fees was 467,000. So we're talking, I don't know that you'll be able to eliminate the student managed ones because it's not really our money, it's theirs that we hold, but they manage, they own those fees. So we have to maybe look into that one, but certainly $2.5 million, $3 million.
I'll put 3 million. Here. For that, I mean, I know this would be ugly, and I don't know that there's a great interest in this kind of transparency, but I think it might be very telling, and that would be to know from each school. Now, what you have is the accounting data, but it would be interesting to even know for what, within each school, what are the fees that are expected for what?
So Chief Little collected that information from the schools, and I think I have a spreadsheet. Most people said they don't charge fees beyond what the district does. There was only like 5 or 6 schools, right, that did?
I mean, and to complicate that, so intercessions you brought up at Clark, there are some of those intercessions that students pay to the district, and then we get the vendors to transport and accommodate and whatever. But there are other trips that are set up where they use a third-party contractor to set that up, and then the students and families pay that contractor directly. So it's beyond just the money. 2.5 million sounded low to me, but many of those trips are set up, and we're not a we don't never see the funds. How would we know? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I mean, I was ready for $5 million if you really talk about it, but I just think that even that phrase, though, how would we ever know? Well, we'll know when something goes wrong. We'll know. And that's the problem of it. And I do think this is certainly percolating out there, and certainly in the next year or whatever, we're not looking to go to the public, but we have to spend the next year or two getting ready to go to the public. And this is something that is gnawing at them because of the property taxes and economic conditions and what have you, and us claiming to be an equitable, or at least pursuing equity.
So we can put a $5 million estimate in as we're building our budget initiative topics as a placeholder, because I think if we remove the barrier of paying fees, more people will participate. So more students may jump in at advanced placement classes knowing that they don't have to pay the fees to take the test. So it might actually increase activity just by removing that barrier. So I think the cost will go up.
Until the barrier goes down.
Right.
So I think on the AP piece, as an AP teacher, and by the way, my students' 50th year of college boards were the #1 in the world, but I just say that about every 6 years. But I would like us to think about all the tests and what we ask of our families to pay, because they can't afford it. And we have many, many kids, and people think that, oh, well, they go to Walnut, they'll be able to afford it. No, that's not true. That is not true. And especially when you have these multiple, now it's a great investment because they'll probably get through their freshman year without having to take a freshman course. So it's a great investment, but at that time, it's hard to write that check. So yeah, I'm good.
Good discussion. Thank you, Ms. Wagner. Ms. Bolton, good?
$5
Everyone's
million.
good for our final topic. And if the one of the two people who are watching would like to say something at the end, you got a couple minutes. Just let Rob know by raising your hand and telling him who you are and what you'd like to talk about. That being said, we do have Dr. Little here to talk about drills. It didn't make it on here, but the last meeting, and actually at the very first policy committee meeting I chaired, way back in 2020, pre-pandemic, pre-child, pre-Stephanie, my God, it was like a different
We have
world.
to clarify what that means.
Pre-Miss Scott. That was when we had to deal with Dan without Miss Scott, and that was hard.
Yeah.
Those were
So
some
we
dark
had somebody
times.
else that was really good too.
She was great, but then Miss Ashley left, and there was a moment there where we
We
just had
only had
Mr.
Dan,
Hoying,
and we were hurt.
and you know what? It's right around the time the pandemic happened.
Yeah.
I'm wondering
It's Danvid.
we
It's
fig-
Danvid.
Let the minutes reflect that, Ms. Davis. Anyway, it was a long time ago, but at that very first meeting, one of the very first things on the agenda, if not the first, I've been chair, yes, for 4 years of this committee, was this topic. Now here we are again, which I think is great because our safety drills are important for our students. We're talking primarily about active shooter drills, and these are necessary, sadly, and they're also required by law, so there's nothing we can really do about it. But they also, for some students, can be pretty traumatic and difficult, and I just want it to be on the record that we have talked about this a lot. We've done our best to make sure teachers are prepared to debrief students. All of our teachers do an excellent job preparing students going into these drills, knowing full well that they can be hard, especially for the younger ones. This again was well before I had my own 3.5-year-old who has an aversion to loud noises, and the fire drill he talks about literally every single day on the way to school. And he's fine now, but every single day, is there going to be a fire drill today? Is there going to be a fire drill today? Is there going to be a fire drill today? So I'm just waiting for when he has to go through these. And so again, I'm very grateful we work in a district where the teachers are attentive to this, but it's still important to talk about. And while we can't change the fact we have to do these drills, we can affect how we administer them. And that's why we have Derek here today. So I'm going to turn it over to you if that's all right.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Morosky. So the district does comply with the state requirement on drills, and that relates to fire drills, a lockdown drill. There's 2 tornado drills that the schools have to do in the spring, as well as what the state calls a theoretical drill, which schools can take a number of different approaches. So that could be a chemical exposure or a water main break, and how do we evacuate, to a potential bomb threat. There's a lot of things they can do in that theoretical drill, but they have to do those once a year. Folks may also have heard this year, because it comes on a 3-year cycle, that we've done a reunification drill at the start of school. We intentionally did that this year without students present, because it's been a long time that schools have done that because of COVID or Danvid. And so they needed to practice that again at the adult level to make sure they were ready. And a reunification drill is very similar to a fire drill, with the addition of you must go to the reunification site. So it's not just get out of the building, it's also walk down the street or down the block to wherever your reunification location is. Cincinnati Public Schools establishes due dates for the drills in accordance with the law, but we do not schedule those at the district level. So each school specifically schedules the drills that they do at the campus level within that time frame that we have established with the law. We also do not require the drills to be unannounced. Like some districts do, every drill's unannounced. It's a surprise to everybody. We don't require that. So schools sometimes take different approaches there, but they can be announced and shared with the school community in advance. Some of these, the lockdown drill in particular, also have to be coordinated with some emergency management personnel. So that's usually the SRO with the school. The state doesn't officially count the drill unless there's some EMS related person present. And so that schedule has to be coordinated in advance as well. We do track drill completion. We have to report those to the state to show that we are in compliance, and there's little forms that principals have to fill out. They've done this for years to show that they completed it as well. Happy to take any other questions for that, but that's sort of an overview of where.
Appreciate that. It was super succinct and helpful. Ms. Bolton, do you have any comments or questions?
No, just that, we're guided by state standards and requirements, but we're not trying to just meet the minimum of those, are we? I mean, is that?
That answer is no in 2 ways. So we obviously want to be compliant because it is a state law, but also it is important for schools to be prepared. We know that there are things that happen on our school campuses which require a school to go into lockdown or require a school to potentially evacuate. And we want that to be as controlled in practice and experience as possible, because that can create other traumas for students if it's just mayhem in those moments. So that's what we're really emphasizing, is preparation and readiness. And as schools need to work specifically with a student or a group of students that may have extenuating circumstances, we support them through that. And we've even connected recently with the new State Safety Center that supports schools. The governor's office created this about a year ago to just double check and make sure our practices were in line with best practice, and they are.
Do you see a range, great difference among and between the schools as to how they do it? You mentioned it's left to the schools to choose the date or choose whether it's announced or unannounced. Is it superintendent think it should all be announced or all unannounced, or?
We definitely do not think they should be unannounced as a practice.
Okay.
If a school wants to, out of the 6 fire drills that they do, make one of those unannounced, that makes sense. But letting people know, and there's been studies on this over time and in other places, announced drills still serve a purpose. You're still testing your ability to respond. So it's not that you have to actually have a live scenario to conduct a good drill. So that's the guidance we give. We probably see a bit more variation on the back end. There are schools who consistently send notices after a drill has occurred. Just families, hey, no, we did a fire drill today in case your student comes home. That's not a consistent expectation that we have.
Just the communication to the families obviously is the critical thing, and I'm glad we even do that about fire drills.
Mm-hmm.
No, I am too. I appreciate this a great deal. And the only other question I would have, and it references back to something that I said in that opening salvo piece, for teachers, Is there any kind of, particularly for the active shooter drills, that's kind of where my head is. And again, it's unfortunate and it's terrible, but we have to do it. And we could talk about that all day, but it's where we are. Is there any, training seems like an intense word, and I don't know if I mean that, but is there any kind of like debriefing, especially with the younger one, older ones too, but I'm thinking primarily the younger kids. Is there any kind of like Q&A or why are we doing this? Like with kindergartners, first, second grade, is there anything like that?
There certainly are. Counselors and social workers are available to help teachers with that if needed. The other thing I want to demystify about lockdown drills. So one, we don't call it an active shooter drill by necessity because there are other reasons why you may have to go on lockdown. And two, we're not doing live action drills. So there's no one actually going into a building pretending to be a shooter. There's no sounds of gunfire. There are some schools in the country that get very sort of brutal and explicit with this. We're not doing that. So there's a button that the office presses. It makes a noise in the building. Again, the teachers, the staff, the students are trained when that goes off. Here's what we do in the lockdown. And so that's how we're doing it. So we've minimized as much as possible, I think, any potential excitability or upsetting students as possible because we don't have all of those other live factors in the drill.
That's helpful. Any other comments about this while we have Dr. Little here? No? Mr. Rob, did any of the two people want to say anything? No? Well, that being the case, we have two policies that are going to move forward, the proposed new one, and then the use of medications with the additional ORC language. Thank you again, Ms. Invis. And then for our next meeting, is there anything that we want to make sure we have on the agenda? I say, Ms. Davis, we'll roll over these 6152 student fees, fines, charges, just to be safe, and the penalties regarding the student fees. I'm sure there will be more discussion within the next month. Anything you would like to propose for the next agenda now?
I don't know. No, I don't have a, I do want to have a little bit of follow-up with in this committee, just as a follow-up is sort of pertinent. And that was some of the issues, because I had a grandmother of a Clark student last night at, I think it was at the Amos meeting, candidate night, upset about the fact that we knew that there was a threat prior to school starting. What is the procedure that regarding notification of families? Because I think that we got some emails about if we'd known, we would have turned around, or we wouldn't have dropped the kid off. What's the administrative guideline or rules or procedures for that when we find out that there is this threat at what time of day?
Yeah, and happy to address that now. A notice also went out, a follow-up notice went out earlier this week to Clark families explaining some more of that. Because in talking with Principal Higgins, we knew there were still some open questions that he wanted to be able to address. Typical process here is within the first 10 to 15 minutes of notification, families would be aware that there is some threat or school is on lockdown. So our communications team does a fantastic job of having rolling communication. The Withrow experience the day after Clark a week ago showed that in effect. So initial notification goes out. Families, we have a potential threat at the school. We're currently on lockdown. We'll keep you updated. And then every 10 minutes rolling throughout the incident, there is an update provided to families and to staff. So that comes through School Messenger, and it's posted, like we take over the school's website and it's posted there. And then there's a wrap up or resolve notice sent out to say, okay, all things are clear. Here's what happened if we know that. And that goes out to families as well. So that's the typical practice. The Clark experience, we actually did a full safety review on that and Withrow earlier this week to see what lessons are learned there. The Clark experience was exceptionally difficult for a couple of reasons. One, the notice that came into CPD actually implicated 2 schools, and so it was really confusing as to which school was the issue and which students were involved. We've had this conversation with CPD, but the media was alerted before we were alerted. which is not typical practice or protocol. So information was getting out before we were even fully informed about what the school was experiencing.
Was the leak or the sheriff district, or did it come from the police officers?
It came from the Cincinnati Police Department. Obviously, every media company has police scanners and they hear things
That's
going
how I
on.
hear it, yeah.
And that's not uncommon, but this seemed to be specifically shared with the media that, hey, there is a threat at Clark. And so there were news vans talking to parents at arrival before we got the first notice out as a
It
result.
was ugly.
Oh my God.
It was awful. Awful, awful. And the other school that was implicated, if I recall, was SCPA.
It was SCPA. We've since learned that there's not an actual connection there. There was a inerrant report which was corrected on the news media that night, saying that it was an SCPA student who made the threat. That is not the case. So just mixed information across the board that day.
Yeah, it's talking to the grandmother. We're seeing all the emails that we got, and then talking to the grandmother last evening. And then also, part of our family is, one of our little family members is at SCPA, so our family then indirectly found out about something, and that, so, yeah, whatever happened there was at Clark, or in that event, was just awful. So I don't know if the procedure was followed, not followed, or was it timing or whatever. The other one you mentioned, you say it worked out okay, but whatever happened at Clark and however it happened that way, bad, very bad. Because families should have the opportunity to know if there is, even though, God willing, it's not true.
It sounds like communication. Appreciate all the work. Trying to minimize. But as Ms. Bolt's point, earlier folks can know, obviously, the better. So thank you again, Dr. Little, for that. Thanks, Ms. Bolt, for your questions. Thanks for everybody for being here today. And our next meeting, wrong pipe, will be the third Friday in November. And if my math is correct, that is the last policy committee meeting of this year. Oh my gosh. So we're just going to end the meeting so I can go cough.
Please do.
Thank y'all for being here.
Thank
Meeting-
you. Bye.